Well, I added this lecture to the previous lecture to make the understanding a little bit wider. And we spoke earlier on the internality of hearing and the external measurability of hearing and so forth. Not being close and not being distant, and why adding a face or a body to the voice actually takes both the body away and the voice. And I call this lecture Keeping and Losing. It is a very modern thinking or a modern thing, and it actually also refers to Ian McGilchrist. We have been given the option of starting a study circle for a local syndicate or a Swedish syndicate. And when asked what sort of study do you want to do, I obviously choose Ian McGilchrist. That is because the literature is a bit steep to pay for. So we will have a literature circuit starting here in Gothenburg with Ian McGilchrist's new book, of course. The two sides of the book, if that would be a possibility, and I think it will. But he also mentioned what he calls the scarcity of satisfaction, pleasure and understanding in the modern world. And I think this has a connection to this. And I made the illustration here. And this could be anything, but let's say it's my body when I'm standing here. And my idea of wanting to keep my body and sort of divide a priori the world into two parts. One that is not my body and one that is my body will make me collapse and shrivel together and lose my balance. And this is the same thing that is pointing to in Heidegger's talk about the voice of the friend. When we designate or predicate extra things, we actually take away. The adding is not an adding, it's a taking away of a wholeness. Let me give another example, and I think this is a rather modern thing that Ian McGilchrist is pointing to in the first part of his book. It's in two parts. I ignore the world, I ignore the offering, as we mentioned before. I ignore the giving, and I ignore the sharing or the community, other people, and I would like to keep the inner, the internality of hearing and friendship. And therein is really the kern, what is it called? This is the main point. This is why it's the voice of a friend. The friend is not unimportant. The friend is important. And by adding these things, we take things away, but also by dividing, wanting to keep one part. And Ian McGilchrist connects this to the Reformation, where for some reason there was a tendency to divide and thinking that the external world was not important and they wanted to keep the inner world. And of course in the Cromwellian England what they want to keep was what was called the inner fire of belief, of faith. These were the Puritans. It's a specific religious development that I think clearer than anything else can sort of show this tendency. The Puritans are a long gone feature from England, but they wanted to eradicate a lot of earthly things a tendency we recognize from history. Might be that Puritans wanted to go even further. So they sort of took things away, or pleasure in the world. You can put a pause if you want to. The pleasures of the world, they wanted to live austere lives and not enjoy themselves. And they didn't interact much. And they didn't put much point in outwardly doing things to the rest of the world. Like sharing, giving, offering, opening up. Actually, they were quite shut off. And this tendency made them lose in both ends. They get empty within, and all the faith they want to keep for themselves vanished, disappeared. This is some thing that was observed, but it was also confessed by many of the Puritans. Many of the eloquent and the ones capable of writing confessed to the fact that they lost their faith. They lost the intensity in faith. So the Puritan movement that was supposed to purify the faith and make it even stronger, Cromwell often mentioned the fire within, the stronghold of Christianity in one's inner soul. It became just the opposite. And it was actually the inner complaining that made the Puritan movement to disappear in the end, or at least lose enough of its strength so it let it go down, and once more, for some reason, Catholicism came back, which is in itself a bit odd, since what Puritanism replaced wasn't Catholicism, it was the Anglican Church. So they lost even more than they hoped for. But it's interesting, this idea lingers on, and it's a very persuasive idea, and it needs to be looked at very different levels. I think Ian McGilchrist is absolutely right. It's something that infuses our whole society, and it's been going on for a long time. But it's not a singular movement, it's not a singular opinion or an ideology. It's more a tendency in reality itself. Keep to the thing that you decide you like, and unkeep the thing you don't like. Why would I like the surrounding things? It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't hold anything of interest, pleasure, richness. It's not part of my body. But the thing is, and we showed this many times, space is actually constructed this way. Remember the Klein bottle and remember the Möbius strip. It is a bit ignoring how space itself is. So the shutting off could be said to be a 3-coordinate system or a simplified model of space. And a simplified model will cut off space in unsuitable places. And as we talked about before, we obviously do that when we cut off the arms from the body. I was just strolling around here and I saw many people torturing their bodies by falling together and sitting on the thighs. This is very painful, actually. This is a sort of suffering. And as you all know, the first thing that disappears is your intellectual power. That disappears within milliseconds. The pain you get in the end, the strain from your elbow, this carpal tunnel syndrome, the pain in the fingers, I've been feeling myself. That is secondary. The first to disappear is actually your intelligence. That's the first victim of this division. And that's also very clear in history, because this was the very same time the first attack on England came. And Ian McGilchrist sees this as a bad thing, but also a good thing. This early on attack actually made it possible for England to stand outside the later things to come, even more horrible. The English Civil War, which in the end ended Puritanism and the rather hard rule of Cromwell, made the English insulated against such things. And I think that lingered on for centuries. They did not ideologically partake in the war that were to came. The destructionist, horrible war of, well, it actually lasted more than 30 years, but it's called the 30 Years' War. Horrendous war that took millions of lives and also destroyed the foundations of Christianity itself on both sides because of the horrors that religion sort of caused on the people. I think parts of Bohemia and Slovakia, up to 2/3 of the population were slaughtered. And even to this day, you can see the areas where the 30 Years' War was as the strongest, the harshest. So that's a lesson, and that was to repeat itself. Later on, within Christianity, we got this movement of making everything inner, and they thought they could keep the inner and giving up the outer, not having to interact with the world, not having to give, not having to genügen, as Heidegger calls it. This is actually very important. The offering is a double take. And what happens in the end, your capacity to psychologically feel faith, to feel good things within yourself, to have a connection to the sacred, that is disappearing. Very interesting research when we look at the MRI scans and the electroencephalograms, and also the newer, which I really like, the movable MRI, which is even more complex and even more expensive. Apparently one of those machinery costs up to 10 million pounds. They're extensively, but they show that the change in the brain, whereas a regular MRI are still photos, the second one is like a video. And that shows clearly that people who say they have a very strong conception, a belief or something, they don't show any of those patterns. And that fractality, so to speak, or this directedness of the voice, it's both internal and external. It doesn't have an origin. By predicating an origin, we take away. We can do it still, but don't see it as ontological. See it more like helping tools. In some instances, I need to locate something, and then I use my eyes, I use my hands, I use a measuring rod, but don't confuse it with reality. This is something I myself call technological knowledge, and that's a sort of a copycat thing of technology, but absurdly simplified. And I think this mirror image sort of blocks out reality for us, and we get into this copy of technology. I call it technology thinking, and that sort of indicates you can keep one and there is a separation somewhere, and you don't really know where. But the voice example shows separation is something that comes later. It's a wholeness. The voice is complete. And in a way, it doesn't even originate within the friend. That was the point of the Heidegger. He doesn't say it's originated in the friend. You can add that later, but don't see that adding on as ontological, as true to the being. It is something we predict, and being thereby becomes beings. And that is different. That is not the same thing. It is not as true. The voice is the truth. So we leave truth behind somewhere, and we end up in sort of untrue. not the real thing. So the inner dissatisfaction is in some ways even more interesting than the outer dissatisfaction, that we don't really feel anything more. And I think we found good examples of that, especially when Kalle read the autobiography by Hugh Everett, or how he felt a loss everywhere and everything was unreal. And I also understand criticism. We're just having an exchange on Facebook. I haven't written anything on Facebook for ages, but when the name Max Tegmark shows up, it's so interesting I can't resist. And I wrote something that, why is it going on with Max Tegmark and his unprovable words? And I didn't know that very line was a little bit like the Necky cube. It could actually have several meanings. And somebody wrote, I don't completely agree. We need to go back to experience, the phenomenological understanding. And this is exactly what I meant. I think it was interesting. This is what I mean. Somehow Tegmark has lost his experiential thinking. The worlds that he sort of draws are not drawn at all. They are not even imagined within him. They are just words. And that, of course, I would say makes for dissatisfaction. Because we want both, and we can have both. We can have the outer offering, and I would like to call that vergnügen, pleasure. We can enjoy, genieße. But we can also, and we are allowed to enjoy within at the very same time. They go hand in hand. So the war cry of the Puritans is misguided to some extent. Going to the inner and just keeping this fire glowing, it seemed to be something that pretty soon in England became dust, ashes, by itself, not by external power. Oddly enough, you can even say, when the war ended, when the Civil War ended, that was the very reason they lost their power. Because all of a sudden there were no external enemy to get the force from. Anger or hatred or those things were no longer around. When they got all of England, it disappeared, and then it dwindled. And then, oddly enough, I think this is really an odd happenstance in history. The old devil that they threw out was replaced with greater evil. The old devil of the Anglican Church was all of a sudden becoming Catholicism, and although it wasn't permanently successful, it could have happened. It was very close to, and it was a couple of years it lasted. That was ended by King James. And then, of course, King James Bible we're all familiar with.
1611.
Yeah. So that was what happened with that. It's very interesting, the takes in history. And how they were actually completely dependent on resistance within the country for their the fire. And all of a sudden, a true fire must be going on even though there are no enemies around. That's the true fire. It has an existence of its own. It's not dependable. But this fire was dependable. And this is the odd take. By taking in the exterior, you make yourself, this part, more independent of the exterior. That is one of the real odd takes. But that was also, I wanted to mention this odd historical twist. It is odd. And that's of course why we need quantum mechanics to put the last understanding in place. Because it goes against the grain of our common intuition about these things. And I think I also want to address a fear here. A fear of losing substantiality. And I looked into myself and I can feel that sometimes reading Heidegger, going into deconstruction, even taking in space around, there is this fear of I'm going to lose substantiality. I'm going to lose my footing. And this is also in the body one of the reasons that we do tense. I do tense my neck tense my knees, my hips. That is the fear of falling, of letting go. But I didn't have to tense when I was younger. I was naturally in the world. And I think that could be a reminder. But do address this fear of losing substantiality, fear of losing grounds for what you are thinking, fear of losing argument, and also fear of losing the original, the actual truth. The first of the first. You are not going to lose anything. It's going to be pure gain. That is important to have in your head. Nothing is going to get lost because this is the actual construct of space and time. Nothing gets lost. So the fear is not a fear. I would call it in a Shakespearean way an unfear. It's not a fear. Not a true fear. It's the apeiron that we mentioned before. And maybe the energy, the fuel of this fear is that we don't know what it is until we tried it. That could be the whole thing. That's why we fear it, of old habit. And I would say that's maybe the worst reason for fear. We haven't heard any rumors, we have no suspicion. It is just the absolute unknown to some degree. This is ContraIntuitive. It goes against the grain of ordinary thinking. And of course, a voice without a face, without a name, also goes against the very grain of our intuitive thinking. If someone were to put his head in here and listen to my previous lecture, they would have shook their head in, oh my God, what is this? What is happening here? What is he talking about? It goes against the grain. And this is one of the reasons why this takes careful and planned thinking, but also a sort of feeling safe that nothing is going to get lost. And of course, this is what drives many people, and the one I was discussing on internet, in Facebook, I know the guy is afraid of losing something, but he's not going to lose anything. His argument is going to get stronger, and whatever he believes, it would turns out it doesn't need the argument, it doesn't need the substantiality that he thought was substantial. And that's the same with the voice. We do not need to add a name to the voice. We don't have to the sound say it origins there and it has as a telos, as a destination, my ear or the inner of my ear. We do not need to establish preemptively, a priori, exteriority and interiority. We can do it later if we want it, but see it just as tools, because the voice carries everything. And this is this unbelief in our senses. We assume we cannot hear anymore. I think there is a great assumption that we don't hear anymore, and that is one of the factors that makes us not hear. But think about it. Think about your sensory organs. There is no chance that you would miss out on anything. How could the ear miss out? It doesn't make any sense even. It's a perfected organ. It is bound to know everything that is needed to be known, and yet some, much more. And then somehow something in you steps out and say, I didn't hear that, or I didn't understand. I need to designate. From whom is the voice? What's his or her face? The flesh. Where is she or he or it situated? That is the point. Very interesting point. Very well put by Heidegger as well. And incredibly well translated. Losing my reality. I think it was a rock tune from not far away. The fear of losing your whole world. Nothing will get lost. It's all in the voice. And I think this understanding can put a foundation for a safer way of knowing things. Because if you acknowledge what you hear, therein lies everything you need. And of course it makes for a much more stable thing. The actual experience, nothing can beat that. And I pointed many times out before that nothing beats experience. Perception is stronger than everything else. And there, in the perception, in the experience, you will also find your answers to your queries, to your wanderings. And therein lies understanding, in the voice, in the perception. We need no longer stop. And by stop, I mean stopping perception, but we can take it in instead. And you feel a widening, and all of a sudden everything can come into existence as it is. Another thing that is partly of this nature as well, that could also stop the understanding to a certain degree. There's something, I went back to Tony Chemero yesterday, and it was a new video clip. He doesn't post a lot, but he was interviewed by a guy. I will try to put in a link here. And Chemero wanted to explain. And as you might remember, this is like 500 episodes ago, but if you might remember, what he pointed out is that there is a problematic nature in putting argument up, seeing development a little bit in Hegelian terms. Thesis, antithesis. This can lead to a massive amount of problem. And once he tried to explain what is affordances to the interviewer, what emerged in the end was that the interviewer was keen to understand, but he put himself in an opposing position. He sort of made an argument, contra-argument, and he thought that would lead to understanding. A little bit like asking, why is that? That's also an adding of a sort. I mentioned an example that struck me later on the last lecture, how you by adding can unnecessarily create less clarity, oddly enough, because our perception is enough, so to speak. It was a conversation, or let's call it a big debate that was going on. And there was one subject that was discussed, and one elderly lady raised her arm, and she started talking about a previous subject. It was a long time earlier, maybe an hour earlier. But how she described the subject made it absolutely clear what subject it was. That is hearing, because hearing is also understanding. But still somebody raised her arm and said, could you clarify that? To what are you referring? And as I said, the old lady made an error. She didn't explain in the beginning, but it was still absolutely crystal clear on what she was talking. So the tried out clarification by the second person was an unnecessary adding. And I would say she stalled her own understanding by saying those things. She sort of diverted the force of understanding somewhere else. And a counter argument can work the same thing. It is not so much counter as an extra additive. It's like I summarize your view into a thing. And if you negate that thing, it doesn't matter. It's still a sort of a simplification. It's a generalization. It's a preemptive sketch of the thing. And that actually stops understanding. So counter-argument, as Chemero tried to explain to the interviewer, can have an opposite effect. Although you think that's a way of understanding things, by criticizing, you stop your own understanding. In the process of criticizing, you put the other person's view into a box, so to speak. You summarize it, and already by the summarizing, making an abstract of it, that's the problem. It's not so much if you negate it or not. That is not the problem. The problem is the summarization. And that is something we need to understand, and that is pointed out is in this Heideggerian example. And that is, when I said, that is the voice of my friend Eva Lotta Strandberg or somebody, I do a summarization and I end the hearing of the voice. It becomes the voice of her. That's a summary. All of a sudden it's narrowed down. It becomes smaller, becomes less for me. I don't open my hearing anymore. I don't hear anymore. I put a deaf ear. And of course this is very hard to put into words. So what Chemero understood is that the interviewer cannot understand that way. He needs to have open his ears, listen carefully. Almost like, I don't know, like a physical process. Listen, really listen. And I think that trying to understand through this way, I don't know how to explain it either. You put a summary of the other thought and then you negate it. Negation is not the problem per se, it's the summarization. To make a negation, I need to make a summary of what somebody else is thinking. That is in itself the problem, because it's a simplification. And this is not listening. This is not understanding. This is not hearing, as Heidegger called it, not listening in anymore. Here you put a deaf ear on. You don't hear anymore. And it doesn't matter once this is started, understanding will be scarce, if any. Scarce understanding. This retake of Heidegger today helped me understand this even more. So it's a good thing to repeat what we've gone through before. And I will try to make a like a sort of a summary lecture soon here and go through all of them and see what parts could be repeated, because they are bound to resound even more in our minds, because they're already stored in the wave. They have not disappeared. And since we don't negate them, we don't summarize them, they will speak even more. We can hear the voice to all its clarity and the finer details. The point Chemero wanted to do was an excellent one, and in the end, I think the interview did understand. Well, I don't know if he did understand, but he knew that was something complicated was going on, and he shut his mouth. And I think for us as an audience, that was really helpful. He was no longer negating, and I could listen. It's in a way obvious that sometimes we need to put the stance down, we need to put the arms down, like Oliver Cromwell did eventually. He realized he didn't have much going for him, but if we have something going for us, that will become stronger if we put the polarity down. Yeah. Okay.
Could you please spell the name Tony Chemero, or Chemero at least, and repeat
I would put in
who is this Chemero?
I would put in.
We discussed him for 500 lectures ago.
Tony Chemero is one of the disciples of Gibson. Gibson was an important character in neurolinguistics, neurology, science of cognition, psychology in the 70s. And he's the master behind affordances.
Yes. That, we spoke about that in the cottage.
Yes.
And
yes.
I don't understand anything about that.
No, but now you see here.
It was in January 2020.
Yeah, ages ago. But this is actually exactly what Heidegger is talking about. And affordances is more or less dingen. Dingen. And this helped also for me to understand Heidegger. Dasein is in the voice. The voice is every Dasein. Just because putting this polarity and making Dasein into me or you, that is also this simplification process. So it's a more open, so to speak, understanding, and it's actually helped by taking in the space. All of a sudden you hear. And I also noticed that when I shut my eyes in the morning, I keep a blindfold or something, my hearing becomes more acute. All of a sudden the music is clearer, deeper, more to my heart, and also smell. And also experience, everything sharpens somehow, and that is true hearing. It is getting into the fact, and it gets so much more satisfying as well. It is like you all of a sudden enjoy a fantastic meal, but previously because of stress, lack of time, or whatever it was, or an environment that wasn't favorable, maybe you were sitting in a restaurant where lots of children were screaming or something like that. But all of a sudden, everything calms down, and you can see this is a delicious dinner. This is lobster, and I don't know what. This is just amazing. This is very good. Heidegger is like a delicious fruit that is being taken to us, and we can not only enjoy his fruit, but we can become more fruitful as well. And we can turn the bitter things into sweetest of the sweetest of the sweetest. They become precious all of a sudden. And even the most boring experience becomes interesting. That is a huge change. That is really putting an ear to things. I think I end there. I say thank you very much.
Thank you.